On the morning of August 23rd, 79 AD, a baker in Pompeii slid 81 round loaves into his stone oven. He scored each one into 8 wedges, the same way he had done every single day for years. Those loaves would never be eaten. They'd be found nearly 2,000 years later, still sitting inside that oven, turned to carbon, frozen in the last ordinary moment before everything ended. This is the story of that last day, the final 24 hours of normal life in one of the most prosperous cities in the Roman Empire, before the sky turned black, before 1.5 million tons of rock and ash per second came screaming out of a mountain that nobody thought was dangerous, before Pompeii stopped existing. Pompeii in the summer of 79 AD was not some quiet little village. It was a thriving city of somewhere between 11,000 and 20,000 people, sitting just 5 miles from Mount Vesuvius along the coast of the Bay of Naples. It had paved streets, running water, an amphitheater that could hold 20,000 spectators. It had over 200 bars and cafes. Pompeii, by Roman standards, was doing extremely well. And on this particular morning, the city woke up the way it always did. Around 4:30 a.m., just before sunrise, the first shutters cracked open. Roman life followed the sun. You rose at dawn, and you worked until the light ran out. The public fountains started flowing. Only the wealthiest homes had private water, so most people gathered at one of the city's 40 or so street fountains. They filled clay jugs. They splashed their faces. They exchanged gossip. It was the social media of the ancient world. Slow, face-to-face, and extremely local. By the second hour of the Roman day, roughly 6 a.m., the city was fully alive. Merchants opened their storefronts along the Via dell'Abbondanza, one of the main roads cutting through the center of town. Bakers lit their wood-fired ovens. Fishermen unloaded the morning catch at the docks. Farmers rolled in from the countryside with carts of olives, figs, grapes, and grain. And then there were the thermopolia, the fast food counters of the ancient Roman world. They were built right into the walls of buildings, with large clay pots sunk into L-shaped stone counters. Inside those pots sat stews, lentils, spiced wine, coarse bread with salty fish, and baked cheese. You walked up, you paid a few coins, you ate standing in the street. Just hot food on the go, exactly like grabbing lunch from a street cart today. By mid-morning, the Forum, the beating heart of Pompeii, was packed. Politicians argued, merchants negotiated, priests tended to temples dedicated to Jupiter, Apollo, and Venus. This was the center of everything: law, religion, commerce, and public life, all happening in a single open plaza surrounded by towering columns. Now here's the part that makes this story so haunting. For 4 days before August 23rd, the ground had been trembling. Small earthquakes, little jolts, barely enough to rattle a cup on a table. The people of Pompeii noticed, sure, but they didn't panic. Earthquakes were common in Campania. The region sat on volcanic ground, and tremors came and went, like rainstorms. They had rebuilt the entire city after a devastating earthquake in 62 AD that killed around 1/10 of the population. They were tough. They were used to it. So on August 23rd, nobody ran. Nobody packed a bag. The markets stayed open. The bakeries kept baking. Life simply continued. Around midday, some residents headed to the amphitheater. Gladiator fights were the biggest form of entertainment in the Roman world, and Pompeii's arena was one of the oldest stone amphitheaters ever built. The crowd cheered, jeered, and placed bets. Children drew graffiti of their favorite fighters on the walls. We know this because archaeologists have actually found those drawings. scratched into the plaster by small hands nearly 2,000 years ago. After the spectacle, the rhythm of the afternoon took over. Citizens went to the thermal baths, the Stabian baths, the Forum baths, or any of the other bathing complexes scattered across the city. This wasn't just about hygiene, it was about socializing. Business deals were made in the warm pools. Political alliances were forged, while people moved from hot rooms to cold plunges. Admission was cheap. Even enslaved people could enter. The baths were the great equalizer of Roman urban life. By late afternoon, around 4 p.m., the city began to slow down. The sun dropped lower over the Bay of Naples. Fishermen mended their nets. Shop owners pulled wooden boards across their storefronts. Families gathered for the evening meal: olives, eggs, bread, maybe fish, or a little meat if they could afford it. Wine was poured, oil lamps were lit, voices carried down the narrow streets, and somewhere beneath their feet, deep inside the belly of Mount Vesuvius, pressure was building. Molten rock had been pushing upward for days. The tremors the people had been shrugging off were not ordinary earthquakes. They were warning signs. The mountain was waking up. But nobody in Pompeii understood that. Vesuvius hadn't erupted in over 800 years. Most residents didn't even recognize it as a volcano. It was just a mountain, green, quiet, covered in vineyards and orchards. The soil on its slopes was some of the richest farmland in the region. People built homes on it. They grazed cattle on it. That night, the city fell into silence. Streets emptied. Doors were bolted. Dogs curled up in alleyways. This was the last peaceful night Pompeii would ever know. In less than 15 hours, just after noon on August 24th, Vesuvius would explode with a force that sent rock, ash, and gas more than 20 miles into the sky. The eruption would last over 18 hours. Pumice would rain down at 6 inches per hour. Roofs would collapse. Streets would disappear. Then the pyroclastic surges would come. Superheated clouds traveling at 200 miles per hour, several hundred degrees, killing everything in their path instantly. An estimated 2,000 people would die in Pompeii alone. Thousands more in Herculaneum, Stabiae, and surrounding towns. Among the dead, Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist and admiral, found on the beach at Stabiae the next morning. His 17-year-old nephew, Pliny the Younger, watched from across the bay and later wrote the only surviving eyewitness account. He described the volcanic cloud as shaped like an umbrella pine, rising on a tall trunk and spreading into branches. He wrote that the darkness was darker and thicker than any night. But all of that was tomorrow. On August 23rd, none of it had happened yet. The bread was still warm. The wine was still flowing. The children were still drawing gladiators on the walls. And 20,000 people went to sleep, believing that tomorrow would be just another ordinary day.